Folks, hello. Welcome to our show. ESG is no longer optional. What every private equity manager should know, at least by now. I'm Nick Donato, an industry strategist here at Navatar, which is the premier cloud software provider for private equity firms and really the wider financial services industry. And today we have a great topic, and that is the increasing, in fact, let's call it avalanche of interest in responsible investment. Now, private equity firms have been relatively slow to take full grip of this trend, but make no mistake about it, that is changing very fast. And if you don't believe me, well, let me show you something real quick here. So these are some headlines from major financial newspaper and industry trade publications from just the past 3 months. ESG interests are increasing among family offices, and Carlisle exec warns that automation is a looming ESG issue. And believe me, there are a lot more headlines we could put up here. But even more interesting is the fact that it's a hard number now that Collar Capital has put on this trend that we're discussing. In their most recent LP barometer, where they go out and poll hundreds of LPs, we learned that well over half of LPs believe that a lack of clarity on ESG is either a problem today or will become a problem in the near future. So in other words, ESG is no longer optional, the topic of today's theme, right? So what Navatar and our friends at Invest Europe have done is pull together some of the industry's leading thinkers on responsible investment, sat them down for you here today, and we're going to ask them what every private equity manager should know in light of all these trends. But before I introduce them, allow me to perform some quick housekeeping and introduce you to our speakers. As moderator, I encourage you to pose questions to our panel using the GoToWebinar widget that should be on your screen there. What I'll do is just reserve time at the end of our show to field them. And also, because this comes up a lot, yes, a recording of today's presentation will be made available, so just look for that in your inbox in the coming days. So what I like to do now is introduce you to our speakers. And Michael, why don't we start with you, and then we'll run through our list.
Thank you. My name is Maaike van der Schoot. I'm the Responsible Investment Officer at Altinvest Partners, a global fund-of-fund private equity platform. I also chair the Responsible Investment Roundtable of Invest Europe, where we bring together private equity professionals from across Europe who are interested in responsible investment with the aim to promote responsible investment in ESG as an investment consideration and to develop guidance for the industry on the topic of ESG and responsible investment.
Thanks. And James?
Hi everyone, my name's James Holly. I'm head of ESG at Bridgepoint. We're a mid-market private equity firm investing in businesses typically throughout Europe. I've been a member of Invest Europe's Responsible Investment Roundtable for a number of years now, and I also sit on the PRI's Private Equity Advisory Committee. Delighted to be here. Look forward to the discussion. Just to say that I was involved in helping Invest Europe publish the DDQ and update, and especially the most recent update that I worked on with Graham, which I think good time to hand over to you, Graham.
Hi, thank you, James. Graham Ardis from Triton Partners. Triton is a European mid-market private equity firm. We're focused in 3 sectors: business services, consumer healthcare, and the industrial space. Raised our most recent fund at the end of 2018. I think we can certainly reflect from a Triton perspective the increased interest and appetite from investors around the ESG agenda. Along with the other panelists, I'm also a member of the Invest Europe Roundtable and helped update and prepare the original Invest Europe DDQ.
Thanks. And Jaideep?
Thank you, Nick. Hello, everyone. This is Jaideep Das. I'm a partner at ERM, and I lead our ESG advisory services to private equity, infrastructure, credit, and limited partners. ERM, for those of you not familiar with, it's a global sustainability consulting firm, and we have more than 5,300 ESG specialists coming from a range of technical, accounting, legal, private equity, and banking background. So some of the experience that I'm going to share with you comes from the 500 plus ESG projects that we do with private equity firms and limited partners across the globe. And that's not just in diligence, but also in the portfolio sort of stewardship phase, as well as in some of the strategic sort of framework development that they're doing. Also, which is related to this kind of discussion that we're going to have today, is ERM worked with the PRI in 2018 to develop the monitoring, reporting, and dialogue guidance in private equity. So that's sort of focused on the post-fund commitment sort of engagement that LPs and GPs would have. So focused on creating something that would be streamlined, but at the same time systematic approach that would deliver value to all the sort of parties involved. So really looking forward to the discussion today. Thanks, Nick.
Well, likewise, and again, thank you to all four of you for participating. And just to make this clear to the audience, all four have been members of Invest Europe's Responsible Investment Roundtable. So if there's anyone who's thinking about these issues deeply for our industry, these four are among them. Moving on to the next slide, I want to just quickly explain why Navatar is talking about this topic. And what we do is we offer private equity firms technology for what we say is data-driven deal sourcing and ultimately risk-free execution once you find those deals. That technology, by the way, is Navatar Edge. So if you're ever struggling to know which target companies deserve your focus, how to prioritize bankers for deal flow, or how to find deals your competitors may be seeing, but not you, which, believe me, a lot of GPs would be interested in. We think that you'd be interested in the best practices that we've helped develop. In this context, Navatar Edge, it's also the central workspace that your analysts, your partners, and your external advisors all collaborate to do things like evaluate ESG concerns and other risks, both pre-investment and during portfolio monitoring, which we'll touch upon. Navatar, by the way, has over 600 clients in 35 countries. Both those counts are growing, so we're uniquely positioned to also just offer you the best practices to help you grow and scale. Today's show, it's also brought to you by our good friends at Invest Europe. I have with me here Erica Blankart, is going to give you the quick background on her group, as well as share some exciting new news. So Erica, quickly, I'm going to hand things over to you.
Thanks, Nick. So my name is Erica Blankart, as Nick just said, and I'm joining this webinar today on behalf of Invest Europe, which is the pan-European association based in Brussels, representing Europe's venture capital, private equity, and infrastructure sectors, as well as the investors investing in those funds. Now, one element of Invest Europe's mandate is to make a constructive contribution to policy affecting private capital investment in Europe. Furthermore, Invest Europe is the guardian of the industry's professional standards, demanding accountability, good governance, and transparency from our members. As part of this work stream, Invest Europe is keen to support responsible investment practices and the consideration of ESG issues within the industry. There are different ways to achieve this, by producing tailored guidance for members, like the Professional Standards Handbook and the ESG Due Diligence Guide, which James and the others have talked about previously, and by delivering concrete and practical training courses. Now, why do we believe this is so important? In addition to developments within the industry, such as growing pressure from investors on fund managers to take ESG into account, also the EU, or rather the European institutions, are increasingly shifting their focus to sustainable finance. In light of landmark international agreements, the EU has been gearing up efforts to create a more resource-efficient, low-carbon, sustainable EU economy. A wide range of actions have been taken already over the last few months, and this trend is only expected to continue and even grow during the next legislative 5-year term. The European Commission, the European Parliament, the Council of the EU, as well as the European regulator, which we call ESMA, which is kind of the counterpart to the US SEC, have indicated both formally and informally that sustainability will remain high on their priority list going forward. One particular piece of guidance that Invest Europe has recently produced for its members focuses on ESG due diligence at the level of the portfolio company. Contrary to its predecessor, which was a pure due diligence questionnaire, this new guide now comprises 3 full-fledged chapters. One dealing with pre-investment, providing an overview of best practices that a GP can emulate in its ESG screening and due diligence processes. One dealing with post-investment, so post-transaction, including an overview of steps a GP can take to incorporate ESG into its ownership practices and engagement with company management, and an expanded DDQ, an actual questionnaire, which is basically a comprehensive list of ESG questions covering common themes across the ESG agenda.
Thank you, Erica. And now what I'd like to do is kick things off with a poll. And the purpose of this is really to just get a general understanding of where our audience is at in terms of their own ESG sophistication. And you should have on your screen there multiple choice questions. So I'm going to allow some responses to trickle in. Okay. Now, what do we see? So it seems that about half of you are in that middle road category. So you have basic reporting and policies in place, but maybe you would like to interweave ESG more throughout the investment process, perhaps during the due diligence, perhaps during portfolio monitoring. And about 15% of you are relatively new to the game, so your firm does not yet have an ESG framework. So to our speakers, we will keep that in mind. And to kick things off, what I'd like to do is I highlighted some headlines that I just pulled from newspapers, and we're of course seeing more polls show that LPs care more about this. But what is driving this ESG trend? That's something that we've not yet identified. So for the first question that I'd like to pose to my roundtable is, what are the headwinds? What are the forces behind what's going on here? And JD, why don't we start with you?
Yes, sure. I think maybe I'll sort of there's a lot of forces, as you said. There's been certainly a huge uptake in ESG activity, both within the sort of private equity community, but more broadly even in the public equities market as well. So maybe I can sort of summarize sort of the three key trends that we are seeing and what's sort of driving this uptake in the market. I think firstly, there's an increasing recognition that environmental, social, and governance factors can materially impact the value of underlying investments. And that's both in terms of downside risks. So if you look at, what World Economic Forum, their global risk report, each year they highlight what are the top risks. And some of these ESG factors really dominate the top 10 risks, both in terms of likelihood as well as impact in the next 10 years, which is very much within the sort of the private equity investment horizon, especially if you think the next round of bidders is going to hold on to the company for at least 4 or 5 years. But also in terms of the upside opportunities. And then there's been more studies in the public markets in that space, whether it be from Harvard or Yale, and then there's been lots of studies. But one particular study from the Harvard Business School focused on, doing a research which clearly showed that companies that focused on material ESG aspects, as well as align that with their business strategy, showed a clear outperformance across a range of financial metrics, be it sort of sales growth, margin, or indeed sort of valuations. And also sort of, I think, touching on that piece is, as we know, a lot of the companies at the moment, their valuations are based on both tangible as well as intangible sort of values. And the intangible element where some of these ESG factors, particularly the reputational, the brand profile of the company, that can really get impacted in a very highly connected, highly transparent world where we see social media picking up on issues, on material incidents on one remote part of the world. And that can sort of go all the way up the sort of the private equity food chain, right up to the sort of the LP. So, we've seen that. So that's one, I think. I think it's the material impact of ESG things. So it's real. It's happening. Second, I would say, recognizing this and responding to increasing questions from their own beneficiaries and other stakeholders. We see asset owners, that is, LPs, limited partners, being much more active. You had some who were already active, we know, and they were, quite granular in some of the questions, but we're increasingly seeing a lot more momentum there, not only in Europe, but also in US, in Canada, particularly Canadian pension funds, but also in Asia. We're seeing some of the sovereign wealth funds in Japan, Korea, and other places, and Singapore really sort of invest both sort of more sort of governance processes as well as resources around the sort of understanding and management of these issues. So we're certainly seeing that, and it's not just an engagement with the fund managers, but also in the way they look at co-investments. So I think that's quite interesting. And the third sort of element is, GPs. Yes, I mean, LPs as a driver. We're seeing, although GPs really look at ESG, we're seeing from a both sort of risk management perspective, but also from the upside perspective, and putting in not just like we saw there in your survey a little while ago, not just sort of relying on a basic level of reporting and policies, but actually implementing that policy. So I think that's quite important. And we're seeing both the leaders as well as people who are starting on the journey, trying to see how they can meaningfully drive performance improvements, understand these issues early in the diligence process, and also sort of keep in mind how the emerging issues, like it could be plastic, single-use plastic, use of plastic, microbeads in cosmetics, or it could be opportunities from a low-carbon, a circular-based economy. What opportunities does that create in terms of investments and origination? So we've seen the leaders really jump onto that sort of opportunity pipeline as well.
I think, JD, if I can just jump in here and just the point you made about from the LP perspective, I think what we're certainly seeing is that the number of sophisticated, comprehensive questionnaires now being received from LPs on ESG, and then specifically on certain topics within that agenda is just spiraling in one direction, and that creates a lot of time and effort required on the GPs to pull together responses. And what's interesting as well is that the LPs are really pushing for concrete examples and real practical insights into how the private equity firm has integrated ESG into their investment decision making.
And it's Graham from Triton here. Maybe adding to that, I think we're moving beyond the push factor where it was just LP pressure. I think, and certainly from a Triton perspective, clearly it's important to ensure that we protect value in our investments, and we need to do the right diligence to make sure we make risk-aware investments. But going beyond that and looking at how ESG is a value creative angle that we can add to an operational growth agenda, building better businesses, an integral part of that is making sure that we address these broad and increasing range of ESG topics, which, as Jaideep said, will either materialize during our ownership or will certainly be, as a minimum, hygiene factors when we come to exit a portfolio company, or more positively, be a positive differentiating factor as to why you can achieve a successful multiple at exit, because you have a business which is well managed and on top of these topics.
Yeah, it's interesting, and Jaideep, especially when you were going over the macro trends that are behind this. Something that I noticed when doing my own research into this trend is that the pickup in the U.S. is not where it is in Europe. So my question to the panel is, did this start in Europe because of LP interest? Was it more so the financial performance and return on exit, or was it this third factor of, look, people are becoming more educated and it's the right thing to do? And the reason I ask is, if this was going to get more pickup in U.S., my prediction is that it would be, based off those headlines and the earlier points made. What might be the primary driving force behind it? My guess is the LP interest, but I'd be curious to hear the panel's thoughts.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think it's not one or the other. I think it's a mixture of various factors in Europe. You obviously had a more sensitized customer base here, who were, like, when you talk about millennials and what you're seeing with the Extinction Rebellion, what's happening, and a lot of these movements have started off in Europe. And those in turn have created pressure on the regulatory regime. So you see Erica touched on some of the European regulations. Even if you look at sort of say product stewardship, so some of the most sort of far-reaching regulations like REACH started off in Europe, but there have been sort of equivalents of that in US as well as in Asia at the moment. So I think it's a combination. And LPs, again, some of the Dutch and Scandinavian investors were very tuned to this subject, but we've seen some of the North American LPs catch on as well. And particularly in the last 18 months, we have certainly seen a huge uptake in the US. And also, I think lessons are being learned. So I think once you go first, there are certain things that work out very efficiently and certain things that don't work out very efficiently. So we can learn. So in some ways, what we see interesting is some of the US firms are taking, they want to learn the lessons of what has worked well, what hasn't worked well. Give you a quick example on that. So portfolio company engagement. So a lot of the questionnaires initially were very it is important to look at, what has happened in the last year, the compliance aspects. You need to understand that and be comfortable with that. But I think where the market is slowly moving towards is, as Graham was talking about, is how do you create value in your portfolio? And that could be either addressing some large risk items or, the upside. So what are the one or two things that you're going to work with the company and help them, improve their performance and add to the bottom line there? So I think that forward-looking piece is getting added. And we've seen some of the US firms really being driven by that. So they're more excited by the management of risk and opportunity. They want to be obviously responsive to their LPs. But I think that, the value piece is quite appealing to them as well.
And Mike, is what you're hearing, how you would be evaluating fund managers? Are these some of the mission critical points when wearing your LP hat?
Yeah, I think from my LP perspective, I can only echo some of the comments made by the other panel members before. I've been active in this field for about a decade. We were one of the few in the beginning, few LPs, I think, that were asking about this, and I think most other LPs were indeed from Europe that were interested in this. But I think also in the beginning there were a lot of US public pension funds that already had some sort of focus on responsible investment, and I think it has grown enormously over decades, and especially I think sort of in the last 2 years we've seen more interest both from the US and from Asia in particular. I think Japan as well. So there are indeed various factors that drive LP consideration of ESG. Risk management, value creation, reputation management, as Jaydeep already mentioned. I think also increasingly we see a desire to create a positive environmental or social impact together with creating a financial or generating a financial return for investors. So a combination of these factors drive LPs to start focusing on ESG, and that then all sort of goes together with other ESG objectives that they may have, or specific themes they focus on, resources they have available. I think what we see when LPs assess GPs for their ESG approach are 4 categories of information that they're after: policy, investment selection, investment management, and reporting. And a few years ago, the PRI, which is the Principles for Responsible Investment, developed a due diligence questionnaire that LPs can use when assessing GPs. It has some 20 questions. It covers all these topics, and it's really quite a helpful tool that has become one of the standards in the industry when it comes to ESG. We use it ourselves. We use it for our due diligence of managers that we seek to commit to, but we also use it in our own fundraising efforts and communication with investors. And I find it very helpful to have that list at hand when I have conversations.
And sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. What I also want to say is that we're stepping beyond the policy side of things here. So I think the vast majority of the funds that we commit to today have some sort of ESG policy. Very often, fortunately, a GP can demonstrate how that works in practice. Sometimes still, the ink on the policy is just only dry when we get it, but demonstrating what you do and how you do it, I think is very important for LPs to make sure that what the GP is doing aligns with what the LPs are after when it comes to ESG, and that is something you want to do at fundraising, but also something you want to do throughout the lifetime of a fund, because then you can actually really show how you've been working with your portfolio on these topics.
And Mike, I don't want to lose this point because I personally find it fascinating when you are assessing a fund manager from one who is just talking the ESG talk, maybe they snuck in a few policies into their investment criteria and perhaps not much else, versus you walking away from a meeting with a fund manager going, yeah, that team, they've got it. Would it be as simple as you sending the DDQ or you asking them questions and seeing how comprehensive the answers are back? Are you interviewing different members of their team in order to get a more well-rounded picture? What are some of the strategies that you're using to assess somebody? Because everybody's saying they do ESG now, but to really get to the core of who's got this practical implementation down.
Yeah, we obviously hold long relationships with GPs and managers, and not only speak to them at fundraising, fortunately. So the process is that fundraising is the point in time when we send a DDQ and we review it, and we've been assessing every commitment in the last decade that we made, and every investment that we've made. ESG was part of our due diligence process. So I think our team knows by now what a good answer is and what a maybe less good answer or more fluffy answer is. But that's also backed up by experience that we have with GPs on how they handle ESG incidents. It's how they respond, how we see them acting in the market. We sort of take that all into consideration in assessing whether we think someone is still a beginner and there's room for improvement, or whether someone is already very advanced.
And James and Graham, same question to you. When LPs are posing these questions, or let's say it's not even coming from LPs, it's a internally driven agenda item. How are you guys evolving from the past couple of years? How are you responding to these questions? What does it look like in practice?
It's Graham here. I mean, certainly we're seeing and can echo the increase in number, but also the increase in granularity of requests. And having been through a recent fundraising process, just a word of caution to those who are going into it, the appetite for this kind of information is increasing. I think where we are now from a Triton perspective is, you can have a policy, but then it's about a program that lies behind that, and then demonstrating performance. And as soon as you can demonstrate that in whatever form works for your relationship with your LPs, that is where you need to take the discussion. And it becomes a much more meaningful interaction with your LPs, where you're able to move beyond, is there a binary policy in place, yes or no? But it's an ongoing dialogue, reporting. I know, for example, with a number of our LPs, we have regular phone calls where we talk about what's happening in the program, how we are progressing, reporting around incidents. And it is evidence of an operational ownership of that agenda. And what really helps from a GP perspective is having that interaction and feedback. If it's just responding to questionnaires and there's never any response to that, being open is a little frustrating. But I think that's where the meaningful dialogue and demonstrating operational improvement can really add value to a GP's approach.
James here. Just one point to add. I think the insights that we got from the process of updating the Invest Europe ESG DDQ, working with the working group on that, is that a number of private equity firms have really taken on the agenda and started to implement their processes and systems. And I think what's clear is that there's no one size fits all, and each firm applies it in the most practical sense that is relevant and fit for purpose for themselves. And I think, because of that, the intention of the DDQ was to at least start to bring out some of those practical kind of recommended steps that perhaps firms that haven't started out on this journey could use. And we're certainly not saying it is the be-all and end-all, and is a tool that we feel that can aid and support existing ESG processes and systems, and for those that perhaps are starting on the journey, can at least give them some practical guidance and insight into what they should be thinking about as they look to integrate this and kind of taking this beyond we've just got a responsible investment policy.
James, I'm glad that you brought that point, because what I'd like to do now is get more detail. Let's get more into that practical guidance. At this point, I hope our audience is sold on the importance of ESG. So, Jadid, let me bring you back in the conversation. What if we were to start from the pre-investment stage? What are some of the challenges? What should these fund managers be considering from an ESG perspective at this point in the deal life cycle?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think whilst we have covered in this forum that ESG is important, and I think there's probably most of the people that you have attending it, they're probably in the willing camp to do something about ESG. But as we all know, the private equity and the investor community is huge, and I think it's a bit of a hearts and minds game. So I don't think we should assume that the deal teams or the people doing the origination, they're fully on board with ESG. I know in certain firms they are, but in a lot of firms they aren't. So I think that message needs to be, the awareness raising needs to happen for sure, as to how it's material, how it can impact PE type investments in a range of sectors, because sometimes I hear in certain sectors ESG is low risk. It could be low risk for a certain topic, but it's hard to see whether it's fintech versus an energy company. The issues would be different, but there will be something that is material that needs to be sort of looked at. So I think the first sort of what we see in terms of trends and sort of challenges, associated challenges, I think the first thing is to just think about the timing and process of DD. As we know, there's lots of capital going into private equity, which is great, but it also is resulting in much more competitive processes. So I think what we are seeing is there's a tension there, for deal teams to kind of, they're thinking, how do we minimize the cost? They want to do diligence, but they also want to be mindful of the cost and the effort that it takes. And also, how do they, they don't want to also upset the sellers as well at the same time. So it's a careful balancing act. And I think what James mentioned in terms of the DDQ, I think it's a great starting point, because, what you do want to do is start broad. Think, holistically, what are the key issues that could impact that particular target company? But then equally, I think what's important to do is, given in this competitive positioning and situations that we are faced with, what are the top 3-5 things that you absolutely need to nail early on? And how do you mirror, because the deal teams, as they get more further on in the deal process, they'll do more diligence, they do confirmatory diligence. How can the ESG diligence mirror the kind of the other diligence process and then focus on the top issues? Because there'll be certain things you want to, it could be issues, but could be fixed. And certain issues which are probably best left for, post-acquisition follow-up. So, for example, diversity. You might want to know a baseline, but you're not going to do a huge amount of diligence unless it's been harassment cases, which is totally different. It's other human rights issues. So it's sort of thinking through what are the big issues to think about and the timing of it. And then second is also the scope. I think we also see there's a precedent, like in particularly in certain markets who've done just environmental or done environmental health and safety. And sometimes we see they'll commission a separate ESG diligence. So you really need to see whether there's an overlap there. Are you duplicating effort? Are the right advisors covering the right scope? For example, ERM doesn't cover trade sanctions. We don't cover ABC because we don't feel we're competent to sort of cover that in a diligence process. But there's other issues we feel very comfortable with, whether it be social, human rights, supply chain. So there's things that we play to our strength. And I think it's for GPs and LPs, if they're co-investing, to feel that they have the right advisors on board looking at the right topics. I think that's important. And also, legal firms cover some of these ABC issues and other things. So you don't want to be duplicating effort as well. And also, I think the scope point is around, I think where the market is evolving is how do you look out for those emerging issues? So just saying, this company is compliant, as we know, is no longer good. There's increasing regulation. Take plastic, for example. Canada has announced they're going to ban single-use plastic. Europe has announced 2021. So if you have businesses that do use single-use plastic in whichever shape or form, how does that impact businesses? So I think the forward-looking element of the diligence would become increasingly important. James talked about some of the issues like climate change. They're more forward-looking risk or severe weather events. So how do you think about those scope items? Like in Asia, we're also seeing a lot more interest in the supply chain sort of diligence side of things, to the extent that one GP involved us even in a diligence state to visit some of the key suppliers, just to get comfortable. It's a key issue, key suppliers. And finally, I think there's a question around what do you actually diligence pre-investment and the reliance on disclosure. I think there's a balance again. We're increasingly seeing, particularly in Europe, the trend to have more vendor due diligence on ESGs. It's less so prevalent in US, and certainly it's early days in Asia. But do you not visit a site? Would we buy a house without visiting it once? So there's some questions to be asked about how much reliance are you doing on debt study versus really kicking the tires and verifying information. Because management might say CapEx is X. Do we just take their word, or do we say that CapEx is going to be sufficient for the next 5 years? It's challenging some of those assumptions, and also using the latest tools and technology out there. Like we use for flood risk, we use the latest data sets to be able to sort of hone in on a particular asset and say what's the likelihood of that, at least at a high level, to be able to say what's the likelihood of that getting even more sort of flooded in terms of or other severe weather events, or it could be drought conditions. And finally, sort of, it's not just a buy-side game. I think Graham talked about the exit. I think it's important to think about that as well. Exit, like we talked about vendor, but also we see buyers think about it very early on. So what's the exit strategy? What is it that the business needs to do? Also, if the strategy is bolt-on, are we going to apply the same diligence, or is that going to be led by the portfolio company? And how do you get that consistency of approach? So I think those are some of the things that we're seeing in the market.
And JD, what you raise are good points. And to play devil's advocate, I'm thinking about this from the perspective of the private equity deal maker. He's aware that ESG is a bigger concern. He's been told that there's new regulations depending on the jurisdiction that he's shopping for deals in. At the same time, he's got 5 rival private equity firms breathing down his or her neck, all competing for the same deals. There's more limited deals now. So the question I suppose to James and Graham is, how do you incorporate all this during highly competitive deal processes? How do you keep on the ESG engine while knowing that time is sometimes of the essence?
I think that there's 2 angles to that. It's Graham here. The first is, yes, clearly there's a competitive environment out there, but this is a positive differentiating factor. The first is you want to know when you should walk away to make sure you make risk-aware investments. And you want to do that as soon as possible in the process, because when you have your full diligence process running with the legal, commercial, financial streams running, that's very expensive. And if you are then to identify a red flag issue during that process, well, you want to stop it as soon as possible. To come to your question, though, how do you build this in, other than just making the decision at the right time, is, I think from our perspective, we look at this as a positive differentiating factor. And we can attest to this in some of our recent transactions, where the management teams of our target portfolio companies have actually looked on our website, have looked at the approach that we have, and are actually themselves, when we look at many of our CEOs, they're personally responsible and liable if these things go wrong, if they have ES or G material incidents occur in their business. And so knowing that they're working with a partner who engages proactively in this agenda, I think they see it as a positive factor if you're engaging in the right way.
I think just to add, I think really it's about as well engaging the deal team as early on in the deal process as possible, to flag ESG, to sit down, have a conversation, understand the long-term, strategy of the investment and specifically the deal process. But it is about trying to, engage early to ensure that these are factored in early on in the process and that it's not left to the last minute. And as JD rightly mentioned earlier, some of these topics can have material implications, and it's better to be understanding and assessing those early on rather than at the last minute.
Yeah, I'll just add to that competitive position. I think we've seen, just echoing what Graham said, with other leading firms as well. So they would, in a competitive situation, do their diligence, even some of the outside in diligence very early on, to really know what are the risks they can manage later on, so they don't bother the sell side. So we've had instances in very highly industrial businesses where they bought the business without any warranties in place. And that was a big point for the sellers. They wanted a clean exit. And a lot of the other bidders might be struggling with those issues. But, so it can be a competitive differentiator. And the second one is also the upside. Again, it's not every PE firm is doing it, but there'll be ones who want to take the company on a sustainability, to be a sustainability leader in that space. So for those family-owned businesses or other businesses, that can be another differentiator for those GPs who are sort of switched on to that conversation. They can relate well and create another sort of relationship or touch point.
And me bringing this back to the updated ESG due diligence guide, I think when you look at the three sections, it was to help and shape how you look at this pre-investment and post, and some of these topics we've been talking about. But just to talk about the third section, one of the things that we reflected on when we were updating this was how even in the 2-year period from when it was first written, the breadth and range or scope of topics that we're now looking at has changed significantly. And some of the topics, and I'll ask the other panelists to jump in if I miss any, but some of the topics that we added were things like climate change and the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. On the social responsibility front, looking at employee welfare, supply chain issues, and on the governance agenda, the GDPR, the data protection regulations, cyber security, cyber risk, and sanctions. Those were just some of the newer topics that we added into the guide. And these are the things that all need to be considered. Is it material or not to this investment? So I think it's important that we scope things from the outset, as Jay said, and then drive forward and support your respective deal teams.
And actually, we have, where possible, indicated topics that certain advisors might be in a position to cover. So clearly, some environmental topics are more suitable to your traditional sustainability environmental consultancy. Yet there are some social and governance issues that perhaps they don't look at, but a legal firm would, or even a commercial advisor. So the guide also tries to help just give a little steer on what sort of advisors you'd want to consider if you're looking at that particular topic.
Yeah, the commercial point is quite interesting because especially if there's sustainability issues impacting the product or the service proposition and revenue streams, you would have whoever that is, it's a McKinsey, Bain, whoever is doing the financial commercial DD. We've quite often supplemented that, in terms of providing the technical input. So I think that's where, previously we were doing more work, I think, in hand with the legal advisors and insurance. I think we're now seeing where it's relevant, the much more sort of tie-in with the commercial advisors as well.
And Micah, I'd be interested to know how all this plays into the co-investment process wearing your LP hat.
Yeah, no, of course, it's also in our co-investments, we do consider ESG. And there's actually sort of two things I'd like to note there. First of all, GPs who have what we think are good ESG processes in place give us an additional level of comfort when it comes to assessing our co-investments from a responsible investment perspective, where we also try to find out in an early stage whether there are sort of any material risks that we need to look into further to complete our investment analysis. It also, I think, the co-investment process, interestingly, also gives us an insight in how GPs deal with ESG topics, which then can feed into our primary and the secondaries processes. And I think you see still great differences between GPs, which is not bad in itself. I think every GP should find an approach that works for them and that provides them with meaningful insight. But I do think that having a structured approach around that, how that is truly embedded in the organization, helps in managing this process in the best possible way, both in implementing it in the investment selection and investment monitoring process, as well as keeping up to date what's going on in the industry. Just as James and Graham just said, I mean, there's new topics emerging all the time, and investors should be aware of what's happening out there.
And so we've covered now the due diligence phase, and what I'd like to do now is, so another portion of this, of course, is during the GP active management phase. So, Jadid, why don't I turn things back to you? How should fund managers be thinking about this in 2019 now?
Yeah, maybe I can just quickly touch on the slide that talks about the PRI and the guidance that we did with the PRI around monitoring and sort of dialogue. I think the dialogue word is very important, and it goes back to the thing, that feedback that Graham talked about earlier. And I think that the LP interaction is quite interesting there, because we've heard GPs say some of the LPs would bring some of the learnings they've found, what has worked well with other GPs to the extent they can share it. They do share it, and that's seen as being very good in terms of driving the bar up in the industry. So the guidance sort of touched on 5 things, and very similar to the the DDQ that Invest Europe has published. So part of it focuses on the GP. The first section is very much on the policy, people, processes. The second section, which is more relevant to the conversation we're having about active management, is around the portfolio company. So what's happening in your portfolio? And the third is again related to that, is material incidents, which could be at a firm level, but probably more relevant for at an underlying investment level. And interestingly, I think what the guidance tried to do is, like we were saying, is try to get some degree of consistency of approach, because we do hear, there's a lot of different types of LP questionnaires, probably covering similar topics. So we wanted to get a degree of consistency and streamlining, but also, use this as a basis for discussion. So some of it could be reporting, but some of it could be a phone call with the underlying GP. And the real focus in the middle section portfolio is to sort of understand, which companies in their portfolio, because you could have a GP that has 10 companies, you could have another GP which has got 100 companies. So how do you prioritize? How do you prioritize both the companies, the issues you're tackling? There may be certain topics that you tackle across the board, whether it be health and safety, diversity, or climate change, or there could be topics which are very specific to certain companies. So how do you prioritize your engagement and support to the companies? Then also sort of for each company, what are the top things they're working on to improve their performance? What are their material issues? Being able to answer that question, what are the top 3 or 5 material issues facing that company, and what is it doing to improve its performance? The only thematic topic that was, that the group decided to put out there was climate change, for the obvious reasons, as you know. So that was the only sort of thematic topic. There were other topics which would warrant sort of consideration. But climate change, for the reasons we've discussed before, was the main topic. There's also sort of the impact that Micah talked about in terms of what's the value you're getting from your ESG program, not just the ESG value, but the commercial impact of it or the broader societal impact that it's creating. And finally, the material incidents. And I think for material incidents, what's important is to build a degree of resilience, but also to learn the lessons. If you've had that lesson in a portfolio company, is that applicable across some of the other companies? And what do we learn, and how do we prevent, you can't totally say it's going to be the chances of happening is zero, but how do you minimize the chances of those incidents happening? Maybe.
I think, certainly working on the DDQ and talking to various other firms and through the conversations with the PRI and various other industry associations, it's clear that the whole agenda on reporting has moved from one of risk management to value creation and articulating the benefits of a firm's ESG activities. And I think that's certainly quite a challenging topic for many different firms. And Graham, I know this is an area that you've been looking at and have actually had some experiences within the portfolio that kind of bring this to life. So I don't know if you want to just mention a couple there.
Sure. I think clearly Triton is a committed PRI signatory, as many firms I'm sure who are dialed into this call, and that guidance document JD was referring to is a very good framework to implement. We've been running this program for more than 5 years now, and what's been very encouraging is we can now see examples from portfolio companies that we've gone through the full cycle from doing diligence, doing the operational improvement, to achieving a successful exit. And just taking one company, a former portfolio company called Avatara, which is a Nordic recycled steel manufacturer. 5 years ago, I think they wouldn't mind me saying this, they weren't achieving operational excellence. But during our focus on making sure that, first of all, they kept their people safe, then we moved forwards to starting to look at the CO2 footprint of the steel that they were producing, even getting to a point where they will quantify and do something called a life cycle assessment, where they could compare a ton of their product versus a ton of competitors' products and demonstrate their sustainability credentials with externally verified data. They were able to differentiate themselves from their competitors and start to win market share. That's about meaningful ESG engagement driving business value. That's why this is relevant, and that's why clearly we need the guides and the templates, but it's about becoming operationally active. And certainly from my perspective in our firm, with a buy and build strategy, you need to ensure your license to operate by having a structured, consistent ESG program in place. But more importantly, that can help to ensure your license to grow. And with these increasing range of ESG challenges that we face across the globe, having this at the heart of, I would say, all GP, LPs approaches is fundamental to achieving positive growth.
Yeah, important point. Also, being conscious of time, I want to turn this over to our audience Q&A. But before I do, if I could challenge all four of you within 20 seconds to provide our, say, 15% or so audience members who do not yet have any ESG framework in place, so they're on the first steps of their journey, what's some actionable first steps that they should take? And if all your answers are the same, then I'm happy there's consensus because there's a more established best practice. But if the answers are different, that's interesting too, because there is no one size fits all model. So Michael, why don't we start with you? What's the first actionable step that a GP should take?
It should first discuss internally why they want to develop an ESG approach, because that's going to feed in how they're going to set up their policy and their processes. And there's loads of stakeholders that can be engaged in that process. But if you don't know why you're doing it, it will be very difficult to decide how you're going to do it.
James?
I'd probably say do some benchmarking, look at what others are doing, and review all of the guidance and materials that are available on the web.
Graham?
Ensure you've got clarity on the aspiration for the firm and make sure you have leadership around the agenda. And from that, you can then build, and as James just said, there's a lot of guidance out there that can help, and also firms that can help structure programs. I would say make sure you have in-house resources, but that's not necessarily the appropriate strategy for every firm, but that will help structure the initial steps of your program.
And JD?
Yeah, and I echo the leadership and like what Mike and James said. Just to add to it, I think the other element is just look within your portfolio. I think there'll be some really interesting things to learn from, both positive and negative, because that really resonates well with the investment team. So if you do find they've been good at something or they haven't been very good at managing something, and do that benchmarking across what others are doing in the sector, I think that helps in building the business case.
And maybe if I can just jump back in, just thinking about it from a logical process, start with your diligence. Make sure you make risk-aware investments, and then the rest can follow on from that. The operational improvement then follows because you've acquired an asset. Then you can move towards exit, and then you have something that you can report on. I would suggest that reporting is at the end of the pipeline once you've got a credible, demonstrable story of active engagement.
All good advice. And I'm going to cherry pick a few questions for the last few remaining minutes. This one's interesting. Mark from New York is asking, my firm leadership seems to be sold. How do I instill an ESG mindset throughout the firm culture? So I'm guessing he's referring to all members of the team, including everything from partner all the way down to analyst.
Training and war stories, in simple terms. Make it practical. I'm sure within your company's portfolio, you will have examples of good practice and examples of things that haven't gone quite so well, and sharing those, because quite often the stories that are not the good news stories don't necessarily get communicated within a firm, and making sure you can leverage that information helps give you the why for your respective firm, would be my suggestion.
I would agree.
Go ahead.
Yeah. And also, I think creating some champions within the different teams. So it's not a battle you're fighting alone. So there will be some supporters within the investment teams, within the compliance ops team. Just finding out who the champions are within the firm can also help.
And clearly, you can liaise with your limited partners. I'm sure there's some angle. Micah, you might want to jump in on that. Your LPs, I'm sure, will be interested in you engaging in this in a more meaningful way.
They definitely are, and I think it's very important that this topic is not only one person's responsibility, whether that's dedicated ESG or part of a broader set of responsibilities, but it's exactly everyone on the deal teams and everyone in investor relations should be aware that this topic is important for the portfolio and for investors. And I think in our firm it helped very much that right from the start I sat down with our investment teams saying, okay, it's been decided, we're going to do this because it's important for us and our investors, but now how we're going to do it in a way that works in our existing processes, and it also gets us to meaningful outcomes, and getting that buy-in very early on is very helpful.
I want to sneak in one final question just before we wrap things up, and that's coming from Sandro in San Francisco, and he's essentially asking if there's any resources that would help his firm keep track of new rules, regulations. Are you guys using a master Excel document or something else to monitor these things?
It's not an easy answer. To be honest, there's various regulatory databases you can sign up to. People also sign up to things like MSCI, Bloomberg, and they give lots of regulatory and emerging updates. So and sort of taking part in forums like this. So if you're a part of an Invest Europe or in the same equivalent, if you find things like in America, there's obviously discussions about and sharing of what are the upcoming regulatory drivers and sort of developments and how people can respond to that. So I think taking part in those industry forums is obviously a good place to start, in addition to any regulatory databases that is subscribed to.
I think some of the legal firms provide bulletins on a quarterly basis on ESG topics and emerging themes and trends, as well as policy. So it would be probably worthwhile looking at some of those and getting on the distribution list.
I would agree. So, folks, that is all the time that we have today. I want to thank our speakers again for participating. As mentioned at the start of the webinar, we will be sharing a recording of today's presentation, so that will include the slides as well. Just look for that in your inbox in the coming days. We'll try to get to you by end of week. I know that we couldn't get to every question, but feel free to also reach out to either myself or Erica at Invest Europe. We're happy to put you in touch with our speakers. So on behalf of everybody here today, I'm Nick Donato. Enjoy the rest of your day.